In the medieval world, a woman's life was rarely her own. Marriage was not about love, but about alliance, wealth, and power. From the moment a girl was born, her fate was often sealed by the ambitions of her family. Fathers negotiated marriages like business deals, trading daughters for land, political favors, or coin. For many women, love was not even considered. Instead, obedience and duty were demanded. At just 12 or 13 years old, girls could be married off, often to much older men. Consent was rarely sought, for legally and culturally, a woman's voice carried little weight. Once wed, her husband gained control of her property, body, and future. Divorce was nearly impossible, and the church strictly enforced marital vows, trapping countless women in unions they never wanted. For noble women, the stakes were higher. They were pawns in political games, sometimes sent far away from home to cement alliances. For peasant women, survival and economic stability left them no room to refuse. Behind the wedding feasts and vows lay a grim reality. Women silenced, bound, and forced into lives where love was the last consideration. Arranged marriages were the norm in medieval Europe, but beneath the surface of tradition lay a harsh truth. Women, whether of noble blood or peasant roots, had little say in their destiny. Families used marriages to climb the social ladder or to secure land and wealth. For daughters, this meant becoming bargaining chips in a patriarchal system. Imagine a young noblewoman, scarcely 14, betrothed to a man twice her age. She may have never spoken to him, but her family's fortune depended on the match. Refusing was unthinkable. Obedience was expected, and rebellion could mean disinheritance or disgrace. Even peasants weren't free parents, often decided unions for survival, ensuring their daughters married men who could support them, regardless of affection. The church sanctified these unions, preaching that marriage was sacred, but ignored the cries of women trapped within them. Some brides wept openly during ceremonies, yet priests continued the vows. Women were expected to submit, bear children, and accept their lot. Love stories existed, but they were rare exceptions. The dark truth remained. Arranged marriages served families, not women. Medieval marriage laws were designed to protect men's power, not women's rights. Consent was often a formality ignored by both families and authorities. A father's word outweighed a daughter's wishes, and once a contract was signed, the girl's future was sealed. The legal framework gave husbands absolute control. A wife's property automatically became her husband's. Her body was considered his right, and refusal was impossible. If she attempted to leave, the law branded her disobedient, sometimes even sinful. The church taught that wives must submit, claiming marriage was holy, even when it was loveless and cruel. For noble women, marriages were political arrangements. Queens and duchesses were married off to kings and lords to secure peace treaties or strengthen empires. For common women, law and custom tied them to men, chosen by family necessity. Whether rich or poor, their voices were drowned out by tradition. The cruelest truth was that love and choice had no legal standing. A medieval bride might cry, plead, or resist, but once married, she was bound for life. Marriage laws acted as a cage, trapping women in unions without their consent, turning vows into chains. In medieval Europe, brides stood silent at the altar not because they chose silence, but because their words carried no weight. Fathers, brothers, and guardians spoke for them, arranging marriages without consulting their wishes. The church blessed these unions, claiming divine approval, while ignoring the silent suffering of the women involved. A bride might be 13, trembling as she stood beside a man she barely knew. Her tears meant nothing. The vows were spoken, the contract sealed. From that day forward, her voice was muted by law and culture. Husbands gained authority over every decision: finances, household, even her body. Speaking out could bring punishment, ridicule, or exile from her family. Noble brides were exchanged like currency to secure alliances, while peasant women were promised to men who could help their families survive. Some women tried to resist, but few succeeded. Their cries for choice and freedom were drowned in a society that valued them only as wives and mothers. Behind every wedding feast and smiling ceremony was a young woman silenced, bound by duty. The medieval bride had no voice, only the echo of a life chosen by others for many medieval women. Marriage was not a joyful celebration, but a grim sentence. Girls as young as 12 could be forced to wed, regardless of their feelings. Fathers saw daughters as assets, their marriages a means to gain wealth, land, or political advantage. Women themselves had no power to resist. Once the contract was signed, escape was nearly impossible. Divorce was forbidden, annulments rare, and separation brought scandal. A woman forced into marriage faced a lifetime of submission. If her husband was cruel or unkind, she had no legal protection. The church insisted she endure, calling marriage sacred even when it was a prison. Some women were forced to marry men decades older, widowers seeking heirs. Others were given to strangers in distant lands, never to see their families again. Love and companionship were luxuries most could only dream of. The grim reality was clear. Women were tools in a patriarchal system. They were expected to bear children, manage households, and accept whatever fate their fathers and husbands decided. Their dreams of love were buried under duty. To be forced to wed was not rare, it was the medieval woman's reality. In the Middle Ages, love was rarely a reason for marriage. Instead, unions were built on property, family, honor, and survival. Women, stripped of agency, were married off as part of deals they had no hand in. Their fate was sealed long before they understood what love could be. Romantic love existed, but it lived in secret. Troubadours sang of passion. Knights pledged loyalty to ladies. But these were fantasies, far from the lives of ordinary women. A noble woman might admire a knight, yet be sent to marry an aging count in another land. A peasant girl might long for a boy from her village, only to be given to someone her father chose. Once married, women had no rights to refuse their husband's will. Their lives revolved around childbearing and obedience. Even affection between couples was often cold, a duty rather than a choice. For countless women, love was a story they heard, not a life they lived. Marriage without love was not just common, it was expected. The fate of medieval women was not to find happiness, but to serve family honor, bear heirs, and endure a union they never chose. Arranged marriages were more than family traditions in medieval times. They were cultural chains binding women into roles they could not escape. Every aspect of life reinforced the idea that a woman's value lay in whom she married and what she brought to the alliance. Fathers arranged matches to secure wealth or power. The church insisted marriage was holy, but rarely concerned itself with a woman's wishes. Society praised obedience, discouraging women from speaking out against the chains that bound them. Even stories told to children reinforced submission, portraying women as dutiful wives and mothers. From nobility to peasantry, the pattern was the same. Noble women were married to secure treaties, while common women were paired to ensure survival. Women became pawns in cultural traditions that erased their individuality. Their lives were dictated by expectations. Marry young, obey your husband, bear heirs, and accept your fate. Some women rebelled, fleeing marriages or taking refuge in convents, but they were rare. Most submitted, carrying the weight of centuries of tradition. These cultural chains were invisible yet unbreakable, forging a system where women's dreams of freedom or love were lost in the name of duty and honor. In medieval society, a wedding was less about uniting two hearts and more about transferring ownership. Women were treated as property belonging first to their fathers, then to their husbands. A dowry often sealed the arrangement, as though the bride were part of a financial transaction. For noble families, a daughter's marriage meant land, alliances, or political strength. For peasants, it meant survival. In both cases, the woman's opinion mattered little. She was expected to obey, to step into a life already chosen for her. At the altar, she stood as a symbol of her family's bargain, not as an individual with dreams or desires. Once married, her husband gained legal control over her possessions and even her body. She could not own property independently, could not leave the marriage, and had no right to refuse her husband. To society, she was no longer a daughter or sister. She was his wife, his possession. Behind the celebrations of medieval weddings lay a stark truth. Women were exchanged like goods, their futures decided by others. They were not seen as partners in love, but as property passed from one man's hand to another's. For a medieval woman, marriage was often a cage with no key. Once a contract was signed, she was bound for life. Divorce was nearly impossible. Annulments required powerful influence, and separation brought scandal that could ruin a family's name. A woman might plead with her parents, but her tears could not undo what was arranged. If her husband turned out to be cruel, unfaithful, or violent, she had no protection. The church commanded her to obey, calling her suffering holy endurance. To leave him was to sin. For noble women, arranged marriages tied them to political enemies, sometimes forcing them into hostile lands where they were strangers. For peasants, survival left no choice. Families needed stability, not romance. Even if a woman secretly loved another, she was powerless. To act her life belonged to duty, not desire. The most heartbreaking truth was that love rarely entered the equation. Marriages were alliances, and women were the tokens exchanged. Their dreams of happiness faded behind castle walls or humble cottages. With no way out, women endured in silence, their lives marked by sacrifice. In medieval society, a loveless marriage was not an exception, it was the norm. In the Middle Ages, women were rarely asked what they wanted. Marriage was arranged by fathers or guardians, often without so much as a question to the bride. A girl's wishes mattered little compared to the needs of her family. This lack of say was rooted in law and culture. Women were seen as dependents, incapable of making choices for themselves. Fathers decided their daughters' futures. Husbands ruled their wives' lives. If a woman resisted, she faced scorn, threats, or even punishment. The church reinforced this silence, preaching obedience as a virtue. Even noble women, who seemed to hold influence, had little control. They were married off to secure alliances, often with men much older, or strangers from distant lands. For peasants, it was about survival, marrying someone who could provide food and security, not love. A medieval bride might whisper her fears to a friend, but at the altar, her silence was required. Her life was decided before she could dream of another path. The reason women had no say in marriage was simple. Society refused to grant them one. Their lives were written for them, leaving no room for choice. The laws of marriage in medieval Europe were crafted to serve men and silence women. Once a marriage was arranged, a woman had no legal escape. Her consent, even if requested, was often forced, leaving her powerless. Legally, a husband gained full control over his wife. Any property she inherited automatically became his. She could not own land, sign contracts, or make independent decisions. Even her children legally belonged to her husband, not to her. If she tried to run away, she could be dragged back and punished. The church supported these laws, teaching that marriage was sacred and indissoluble. Wives were told to obey, no matter how unhappy they were. Husbands, meanwhile, had the right to discipline their wives, sometimes harshly, with no interference from the courts. For noble women, marriage laws meant being traded between kingdoms like bargaining chips. For peasants, it meant being tied to a man chosen by necessity. Across all classes, women's voices were erased by law. Medieval marriage laws were not protective, they were chains. They ensured that women remained silent, dependent, and controlled, trapped in unions they never wanted but could never escape. The life of a medieval bride was far from the romantic image of gowns and feasts. Behind the celebrations lay a harsh reality. Marriage was a duty, not a dream. Young girls, sometimes barely teenagers, were promised to men chosen by their families. At the altar, their futures were sealed, often with strangers, much older than themselves. Tears and fear were common, but the ceremony continued. From that moment, their lives were no longer their own. A bride became the property of her husband. She was expected to obey him, bear his children, and manage his household. If he was kind, she might find comfort, but if he was cruel, she had no protection. Her rights were minimal, her voice ignored. Noble brides were sent far away to foreign courts, used to secure alliances. Peasant brides had little more than hard labor and survival awaiting them. For all, the expectations were the same: silence, submission, and endurance. The harsh reality was that being a medieval bride was not a blessing, but a burden. Beneath the smiles and ceremonies lay lives filled with sacrifice, silence, and the loss of freedom. Marriage contracts were binding documents that shaped women's entire lives in the Middle Ages, written and signed by fathers, guardians, or lords. These agreements often treated women as commodities, traded for land, wealth, or alliances. A girl might never meet her husband until the wedding day. Once the ink was dry, her freedom was gone. She could not reject the match, and her consent was often assumed rather than given. The contract not only arranged the marriage, but transferred her dowry, property, and rights into the hands of her husband. These contracts were powerful tools of control. For noble women, they tied dynasties together, sometimes forcing them into hostile territories. For peasant women, they ensured survival, but at the cost of personal choice. In both cases, the woman's freedom was sacrificed to family interests. Even after marriage, the contract dictated her life. She had no claim to her property, no legal independence, and no way to escape. The document reduced her from an individual to a possession. Medieval women's freedom vanished the moment the marriage contract was signed. What seemed like a legal agreement was, in truth, the loss of her voice, her autonomy, and her dreams. In medieval society, love was rarely part of a woman's marriage. From the moment of birth, her future was often planned. Her life mapped out, not by her heart, but by her family's ambitions. When marriage came, it was rarely to someone she loved. It was to someone chosen for her. This denial of love weighed heavily. Stories survive of young women who secretly longed for someone else, perhaps a childhood friend or a knight admired from afar. Yet they were married to strangers, much older men, or even enemies of their families. Their private dreams of love were sacrificed to public duty. The struggle was not just emotional, but cultural. The church taught that passion was sinful and that women must obey their husbands. Noble women were expected to secure dynastic power, while peasants had to ensure survival. Either way, their hearts were ignored. Some women resisted, writing letters of protest or even fleeing, but most endured in silence. Love was denied to them, treated as a luxury they could not afford. For countless medieval women, the greatest struggle was living a life dictated by duty while their hearts yearned for freedom. Medieval culture was built upon traditions that left women powerless. Marriage was not a matter of affection, but of honor, status, and family legacy. Society celebrated obedience, teaching daughters from childhood that their role was to marry well, not to marry for love. Songs, stories, and even religious sermons reinforced this idea. Troubadours might sing of courtly love, but those romances rarely translated into real marriages. Instead, they reminded people that love was for fantasy, while marriage was for duty. Women were taught to accept that their hearts did not matter. At weddings, brides stood silent, their families speaking for them. A woman's tears were often seen as weakness, not protest. Once wed, she was expected to serve her husband and bear his heirs. If she resisted, she risked shame or punishment. Cultural enforcement was stronger than chains. It shaped minds, convincing women that their suffering was normal and even virtuous. Love was dismissed as selfish, while sacrifice was praised. Through these cultural pressures, countless women were locked into loveless marriages, not by force alone, but by the weight of a society that demanded silence and obedience above all else. Marriage in the Middle Ages was often a cruel game, where women were pawns, moved across the board of politics and power. For noble families, daughters were bargaining chips, exchanged to secure alliances, land, or peace treaties. For peasants, they were married off for labor and survival. The cruelty lay in how little choice women had. A noblewoman might be sent hundreds of miles away to marry a stranger she had never met, while her family celebrated the political advantage. A peasant girl might be forced to wed a man she did not love simply to ensure her family's survival through hard winters. The pawns themselves rarely had voices. They were expected to smile, obey, and fulfill their roles as wives and mothers. If their husbands were kind, they were fortunate. If not, they were trapped in misery with no path of escape. The truth was simple and cruel. Medieval society saw women not as individuals, but as tools. Their worth was measured in alliances, dowries, and heirs, not in dreams or desires. In this vast game of power, women were the pieces moved, never the players. Choice was a luxury medieval women did not have. Marriage was a decision made by fathers, lords, or kings, leaving women with no voice in their own futures. Their personal feelings were ignored, overshadowed by family duty and societal expectations. A noblewoman might be forced into marriage with a political enemy to secure peace, while a common girl might be given to a man who could provide for her family. In either case, the woman herself had no power to refuse. Her life was dictated by the choices of others. Once married, the oppression deepened. A wife's property became her husband's, her freedom diminished to obedience, and her purpose narrowed to bearing children. Laws and customs reinforced this silence, and the church praised submission as holy. Some women tried to escape, joining convents or fleeing, but most endured, their desires buried under the weight of expectation. Their oppression was not always violent, but constant, a daily reminder that they were never free to choose. In the Middle Ages, women lived without choice, trapped by a system that saw them not as equals, but as possessions in a world ruled by men. For many medieval women, marriage was less a union than a prison. Once the vows were spoken, the door closed, and escape was nearly impossible. Divorce was outlawed, annulments were rare, and leaving brought ruin to both woman and family. Within this prison, women endured lives of silent suffering. Husbands held full authority, able to command obedience without question. If a woman was unhappy, her complaints carried no weight in the courts or before the church. Her body, her property, and her future were controlled entirely by her husband. Some marriages were kind, but many were harsh. Women might endure neglect, infidelity, or abuse, yet they were expected to remain loyal and submissive. To resist was to invite punishment or shame. For noblewomen, the prison was gilded, surrounded by wealth and luxury but still locked with duty. For peasant women, it was harder, filled with toil and labor under a husband she never chose. Marriage, for countless medieval women, was not freedom, but confinement. Their lives became silent endurance, their suffering hidden behind vows that bound them not to love, but to lifelong captivity. In the Middle Ages, marriage was not simply a partnership, was a legal cage for women. Once a woman married, she was bound by laws that erased her independence. Her property, no matter how large or small, instantly became her husband's. She could not make contracts, own land, or act in court without his permission. The law gave husbands near total authority. If a wife resisted, her words carried no weight. Even her children were considered the property of her husband, not her. The church, instead of protecting women, reinforced this system by teaching obedience as holy and resistance as sinful. For noble women, the law meant their dowries and lands passed into their husbands' hands. For peasants, it meant surrendering even the little independence they had. In both cases, women's lives were legally bound to men who often cared more for control than for companionship. Marriage was not just a vow, was a contract of ownership. The legal chains that bound women were invisible but unbreakable, ensuring that, once married, they belonged to their husbands in every way. The law left women powerless, their lives dictated by a system built to keep them silent. The wedding vows of medieval women often hid a heartbreaking truth. Many of them had no choice in saying yes. At the altar, tears and silence were common, but refusal was almost impossible. Families, priests, and society demanded obedience, and women who resisted risked shame or exile. Young girls were often forced into vows before they fully understood their meaning. A noble daughter might be sent to marry a man she had never met, while a peasant girl might be forced into marriage to ensure her family's survival. In either case, her consent was a performance, not a reality. Once spoken, those vows were chains. A woman could not escape the marriage without scandal, and the church declared her bound for life. Husbands gained full authority, while wives were told to endure. The cruelty of forced vows lay not only in the silence of women, but in the permanence of their situation. Once the words were uttered, their fate was sealed. The medieval woman, as I do, was not an expression of love or choice, was a command she could never refuse. In medieval society, women were not treated as partners in marriage, but as property to be exchanged. A daughter was her father's possession until her wedding day, when she was handed to her husband. The dowry she carried, whether land, gold, or livestock, was part of the bargain, sealing the deal as though she were merchandise. Once married, a woman's individuality was erased. She was no longer seen as a daughter or sister, but simply as wife. Her worth was measured not by her character, but by the heirs she produced and the property she brought. Husbands had full authority over their wives, while wives had almost no rights. A woman could not freely leave, nor could she control her wealth or inheritance. She existed within the framework of her husband's household, bound by law and tradition. Some men treated their wives kindly, but kindness was not required. The system itself reduced women to possessions, valuable only in what they could provide. Marriage was not a union of equals, it was a transfer of ownership. For medieval women, being a wife often meant losing the chance to be seen as a person at all. Beneath the festive music and feasting of medieval weddings lay a much darker reality. For many women, the ceremony was the beginning of a lifelong trap. Once vows were spoken, escape was almost impossible. Families celebrated, but for the bride, the wedding often meant the end of her freedom. She was bound to a man she did not choose, trapped in a role society had carved out for her. The beautiful dresses and decorated halls masked the truth that her life was no longer her own. For noble brides, the trap extended beyond the household. They were political pawns, often sent to foreign lands, isolated from their families. For peasant brides, the trap was daily survival, endless labor under the authority of husbands who saw them as property. The church reinforced this prison, declaring marriage sacred and unbreakable. Women who tried to escape were condemned as sinners, no matter how much they suffered. What appeared to be a joyous celebration was, for countless women, the first step into captivity. Medieval weddings were less about love and more about control, trapping women into lives where their choices were silenced forever. Consent was the foundation of marriage in name only. In reality, medieval women had no true freedom to accept or refuse. Families arranged matches, contracts were signed, and women were presented as brides, with little regard for their wishes. A noble daughter might be promised to secure political alliances, while a common girl was given to someone who could provide food or stability. If a woman resisted, she was seen as disobedient or ungrateful, a danger to her family's honor. The pressure to conform left her with no real choice. Once married, freedom vanished entirely. A woman's property, body, and labor belonged to her husband. She could not leave him,
nor could she refuse his demands.
The church preached obedience, making resistance not only a crime against society, but also a sin against God. For medieval women, the lack of consent meant a lifetime without freedom. Their lives were dictated from the cradle to the grave, their voices silenced at the altar, and their fates bound to men they never chose. The truth was harsh. Without consent, women had no freedom, and, without freedom, they endured lives of submission and sorrow. Behind the smiles
Expected at medieval weddings was often deep sorrow.
many brides, some no more than children, were married off without any choice in the matter. Their futures were decided by fathers and lords who saw marriage as strategy, not love. The sorrow began long before the ceremony. Girls knew from an early age that their lives were not their own. Their worth was tied to their dowry, their lineage, and their ability to bear children. When the day came, a bride might be handed to a man she had never met, her tears hidden behind a veil. Once married, she had no voice. Her husband's word was law, and her duty was to obey. If he was cruel, she had no recourse. If he was distant, she endured loneliness. Even if her heart longed for another, she was trapped. For noble brides, this sorrow was hidden behind silks and feasts. For peasant brides, it was buried in toil and hardship, yet the feeling was the same. A life chosen by others. A destiny they could not escape. Medieval brides carried sorrow quietly, their tears silenced by vows they never chose to speak. Marriage in the Middle Ages was more than a union. Between two people, it was a cultural system that oppressed women. From childhood, girls were raised to believe their purpose was to marry, serve, and submit. Stories, traditions, and even sermons reinforced their duty. Love was treated as a distraction, something dangerous or sinful. True virtue, society taught, was found in obedience. Women who resisted were seen as rebellious, even unnatural. To refuse marriage was to shame one's family and risk being cast aside. Once married, cultural oppression deepened. A woman's role was clearly defined. She was to serve her husband, raise children, and preserve his honor. If she stepped outside those boundaries, she faced ridicule or punishment. The church sanctified this oppression, preaching that wives must submit as unto God. Even women of power, like queens and noble ladies, were still bound by these cultural rules. Their influence was limited, and their lives were dictated by the men around them. Through marriage, culture itself became a weapon. It trained women to accept silence, duty, and sacrifice as their destiny. In this way, medieval society ensured women remained trapped in roles they never chose. For medieval families, marriage was less about love and more about business. Women as slaves were reduced to bargaining chips in a system that treated unions as deals between men. Fathers negotiated contracts, dowries were exchanged, and brides were handed over as part of the arrangement. A noble woman's marriage might secure peace between kingdoms, her hand sealing an alliance that armies could not. A peasant girl's marriage might guarantee her family food, labor, or protection. In both cases, the bride's feelings were irrelevant. These deals stripped women of agency. They were not asked if they wanted the match, they were simply given. Once the bargain was struck, there was no escape. Divorce was nearly impossible, and leaving brought scandal. Husbands gained power, wives lost freedom, and society accepted it as normal. Even the wedding ceremony reflected this reality. A father gave away his daughter, passing her like property into another man's control. The contract mattered more than the vows, and the deal mattered more than the bride. For medieval women, marriage was not a partnership, but a transaction. Their lives were dictated by deals made in halls and kitchens, where love had no place. The medieval world celebrated marriage as a sacred union. But for women, it often meant oppression disguised as holiness. Beneath the church's blessings and family celebrations lay a system designed to silence and control them. Once married, a woman lost her rights. Her husband became her guardian, her authority, and often her jailer. Her property became his, her children were legally his, and her choices vanished. Even her body was no longer her own. Marital consent was assumed, leaving women powerless. This oppression extended across all classes. Noble women, despite their status, were traded in political marriages. Their lives used to strengthen kingdoms. Peasant women faced endless labor, their marriages arranged for survival. Love and personal happiness were dismissed as unimportant compared to duty. The church taught that a good wife was obedient and silent. To question her marriage was to question God's will. With no escape and no support, women endured in silence. their sorrow hidden behind the image of marital unity. The sad reality was clear. Marriage oppressed women not only legally, but spiritually and emotionally. What was celebrated as holy became, for many, a lifelong prison. Love was a dream denied to countless medieval women. While songs of courtly romance filled castles and troubadours sang of passion, real marriages were rarely about affection. Society valued alliances, dowries, and heirs far more than love. From the start, women were told love was not their concern. Fathers and lords arranged marriages with practical goals in mind: land, wealth, or survival. A girl might dream of love, but her reality was duty. To wish for more was often seen as foolish or selfish. At the altar, brides stood silent, marrying men they did not choose. Some were strangers, others were decades older. Once married, the expectation was obedience, not affection. Even if a husband offered kindness, it was rare that love blossomed from forced unions. Society reinforced this denial at every turn.
The church praised duty over desire, while culture celebrated sacrifice above happiness.
Women were expected to bury their personal dreams for the good of their families. Thus, society itself denied them love. Medieval women lived lives dictated by contracts and vows, their hearts silenced by a system that valued tradition and power over the possibility of true affection. Imagine standing at an altar beside a man you have never spoken to, knowing he will control your life from that moment forward. This was the painful reality for countless medieval women forced into marriages with strangers. Many brides first met their husbands on their wedding day. Their fathers had already signed the contracts, exchanged dowries, and sealed the deal. For the women, there was no escape. Refusal meant shame, dishonor, or punishment. Fear was often their only companion as vows were spoken.
Once married, these strangers became husbands with full authority.
A woman had to submit, regardless of whether her husband was kind or cruel. If he was violent, she had little protection. If he ignored her, she endured loneliness. If he demanded heirs, she had no choice but to comply. The pain of these unions ran deeper than the physical. It was the emotional wound of knowing one's life had been stolen before it even began. Dreams of love, laughter, or companionship were replaced by duty, obedience, and survival. For medieval women, marrying a stranger was not an exception, but a rule. Their pain was silent, but it defined their lives in a world that denied them freedom. Medieval marriage promised stability and honor, but for women, it often became a loveless trap. Once bound by vows, escape was nearly impossible. Divorce was rare and condemned. Annulments were limited, and separation carried heavy stigma. Women were locked into bonds they had never chosen. Love was not the goal of these. Marriage's duty was. Husbands sought heirs, families sought alliances, and the church sought obedience. A woman's happiness was irrelevant. If her husband was indifferent or harsh, she had no refuge. Even queens and noble women lived within these walls, powerless to break free. The bonds of marriage extended beyond the home. Women lost ownership of property. Their legal rights were stripped, and even their children belonged to their husbands. The law and culture alike supported this prison, leaving women without defense. Some women endured with quiet resilience. Others broke under the weight of lovelessness, their stories buried by history. Yet the truth remains. Marriage, celebrated as holy, often served as a trap for women in medieval times. These loveless bonds were not merely personal tragedies. They were the structure of society itself, a system designed to control and silence half of its people.